Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the rustic Vaughan Lodge, where I'm filming a video on Sunday that isn't the Sunday Penguin, because I forgot to bring a penguin up with me to the Vaughan Lodge. And I don't know that this is going to go out on Sunday anyway, because I did get new internet here, but I don't know how well it works, so we'll see. We'll see. And also, I'm a genius, so I'm filming this in the kitchen of terror. I felt like this was a horror themed video, so I should have a terrifying background. But the sun is coming up like right now, so I'll probably just have like this indistinguishable face, which is probably better, frankly. Anyway, I decided to do this tag, The Faces of Horror, which was an original tag created by Juan at Plagued by Visions. You probably know about Juan's channel at Plagued by Visions. If you don't, Juan's channel is amazing. It is one of the best book-related channels I've ever seen. It's that good. And I'm not just saying that. It really is that good. Juan talks mostly about kind of disturbing fiction, disturbing books, horror fiction, that kind of thing. And he does it with such insight and intelligence and sensitivity. He's kind of a genius, this guy. So I highly recommend Juan's channel. And he created this original tag all about horror. So, you know, of course I'm going to do that. So The Faces of Horror, an original tag. Let's get right to it. Only 6 questions, so it shouldn't go on forever. We'll see. Okay, and I even took notes, you know, so I wouldn't forget what to say in the middle of my video like I like to do. Okay, prompt 1. A horror story that scared or disturbed you. Not too much frightens me because I'm so incredibly brave, but I'll mention a few. There was Dark Tales by Shirley Jackson. I'm just going to throw that out there because that has some stories that are just disturbing. Shirley Jackson's good at disturbing you in a subtle, kind of quiet way, and sometimes in a not so subtle way. But she writes disturbing stuff sometimes. It just kind of gets under your skin sometimes, or it's just like, oh man. So Shirley Jackson, Dark Tales. That one, of course. I'm also going to say I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. It had that great scene in it where Neville, the last man on Earth, in a planet full of vampires, is out during the day. He's doing his routine, and he doesn't realize his watch has stopped. So he thinks it's earlier than it is, and then he's like, "Oh hell," you know. And then he realizes that it's much later than he thought it was, and he has to try to get home before the vampires come out and get him. And there's a real sense of danger, and I remember that moment specifically when I was reading it for the first time, and it was great. It was great. I don't remember how old I was when I read that book for the first time in this tattered paperback copy, but it was a supreme moment, and that book had a few of them. Because like at the time when I read it, it's not like now when everybody knows what that book is and what the book's about. I had never heard of this book, didn't know what it was about, and it just kind of blew my mind. And it had lots of moments like that. I'm also going to mention Pet Sematary by Stephen King, because that had a lot of disturbing moments in it. It's one of those books where Stephen King really succeeds in both being frightening and disturbing. He doesn't always succeed at that, but in this book he did, man. He really did. There's some disturbing stuff in that book, and that's one of the reasons it's so good. Also, I'm going to mention A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay, because that was genuinely a frightening book. Also disturbing, and also kind of sad. So A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. That was good also. Okay, what question are we on? Okay, prompt number 2. A horror story that depressed you or made you cry. Well, I don't cry because I'm all macho and stuff. I'm too full of toxic masculinity to cry, thank goodness. Yeah, I never cry. But, depressed? Yes. And I'm going to go with another Paul Tremblay book, I'm going to go with Devil's Rock, which is a very sad book. It's a good book. It's not a perfect book. It has its issues. Paul Tremblay was inspired to write this book in part because of a film he saw called Lake Mungo, which is a 2008 film, which was really good. I highly recommend that movie, Lake Mungo. But this book was a little too close to that at times. But despite that, it is a really sad book, and it does leave you kind of, you know. So yeah, that was that was kind of a depressing book. If you've read it, you know what I mean. Which brings us to number 3, a horror story that made you laugh. Again, there are not many of these. I was hard pressed until I remembered, of course, Herbert West Reanimator by H.P. Lovecraft, which did make me laugh. The Herbert West Reanimator, the further he gets into the story, the more he deliberately lampoons himself and the whole idea. He wrote this for a pulp, a really, really awful pulp called Home Brew. And the guy the editor was like, you can't make these too horrible. Make these just ghastly and awful. And so it was a multi-chapter story, 1 chapter each issue. And each chapter was more and more ghastly. And he deliberately went over the top towards the end. And in the very final chapter, there are moments of pure comedy. And see, H.P. Lovecraft, people think he doesn't have a sense of humor or didn't have a sense of humor, and he really did. And in this story, you really see it. So yeah, that's the one. Let's go for number 4, a horror story that made you angry. I was trying to think, what horror story made me angry? A lot of nonfiction makes me angry. Mostly things that have to do with real life make me angry. And so this was kind of a tough one. But then I remembered The Walking Dead. And The Walking Dead did make me angry at one point. Right around, I think it was issue 100. And this is spoiler alert for Walking Dead. Spoiler alert! Alert! Spoiler alert! Yeah. Spoiler alert for The Walking Dead. So this happened a while ago, and if you've seen this stupid TV show, you know what happened. But at issue 100, a main character, Glenn, is killed off in the most brutal and awful way they could have done it. I mean, it's just, oh man, it was gruesome and awful. And it annoyed me. It was issue 100, and so they had to kill somebody, you know? So it's just like he's the sacrificial victim. And it's like, well, it pissed me off because I liked Glenn, and I felt like they're just doing it because it's issue 100. That's all. That's the only reason you're doing it. That's the only reason you're killing Glenn. But I got over it. That comic book series, The Walking Dead, is pretty good. Just to pretend the TV show didn't exist. Because the comic book is actually really good. It's really, really long if you read the whole series. But it does have a beginning, a middle, an end. It has a satisfying conclusion. So it's a good story if you just take it as a whole. But that one bit of it, where Glenn bit it, man, I was pissed. So yeah, that's the one. Number 5, a horror story that is important to you. For sentimental reasons, probably. I'm going to go for a couple of things here. I'm going to mention a couple of horror stories, all of which you've heard of. There's not a lot of hidden gems in this video, sorry. But the first one is not just for sentimental reasons, but also because it's really, really good, which is Bram Stoker's Dracula. Of course it's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Of course it is. It is the first adult novel that I ever read. And I was a little kid when I read it, and so I didn't really understand everything that was going on in the book. But I knew it was good, and I was just glued to the whole thing, and I read the whole thing. And I read it several more times. I've read it many, many times in my lifetime, and it always delivers for some reason. And I always get something out of that book. But yeah, that book is important to me just because, well, it's a great story. It's in a very important horror story. It was the first horror story I ever read, the first adult book that I ever read, the first novel I ever read. So there's a lot of reasons. Dracula is important to me. I'm also going to go not just with a story, but a whole set of stories, which is the EC Comics horror line, which was Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. I believe that was the three of them. And they also had a bunch of like shock suspense stories. A bunch of their other comics were actually horror stories as well. But I'm just going to talk about the main horror from EC Comics. EC Comics did some of the greatest horror stories ever done. These were some of the greatest comic book stories ever written. Tremendously successful little stories. The quality of the stories and art was fantastic. They started off good, but they got really good really quickly. If you've never read the EC Comics, and you're interested in horror at all, hunt these down and read them. Okay, they're being reprinted now, so they're easy to get. You can get them digitally. You can get them in all kinds of ways now. They're very accessible. And I read these when I was very young. My stepfather had a whole bunch of these. He grew up reading EC Comics horror. And so when I was a little kid, I was reading these gruesome, horrifying stories with zombies and monsters and killing and guts and everything. I mean, these were some gruesome stories. And I loved them, man. I loved them. And if you read them now, they're still really, really good. I mean, just excellent stories. As stories, they're great. EC Comics horror. Like I said, if you're interested in horror at all, read these. Read these. And they're important to me. The next one I'm going to go with is a film, actually. You've all heard of this. This would be The Wolfman. Lon Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman. I loved this when I first saw it, and I've loved it since. Last time I saw it was last Halloween, which I saw screened on a ship in the Richmond shipyard. There's a ship there. They play movies inside the ship. They would play movies that opened during World War II, which was the era of the ship. The ship I'm forgetting. Was it the Red Oak Victory? I think it was. Anyway, The Wolfman. This film, first of all, I love werewolves, probably because of this movie. And here we have Lawrence Talbot, a decent guy, a good guy, a guy who's done nothing wrong. And he ends up being cursed with this horrible curse, which transforms him into a savage animal that wants to kill everything that he loves. So it's bringing out his ultimate dark side. It's subverting his personality. It's taking him over, and he has no power over it. And it's a horrible curse. And it's one of the earliest stories that I experienced as a young person about an innocent person who's just inflicted with this terrible thing that happens to him. And it doesn't have a happy ending, right? This movie does not have a happy ending. Spoiler alert, doesn't have a happy ending. And it's one of the first movies I experienced like that. And that, it's an old cheesy horror movie. At least most people are going to think it is. But the horrifying thing about it, and the disturbing thing about it, as a young person watching it, was that this was a good person, a decent guy, and this terrible thing happened to him, and he didn't come out on top at the end, right? It had a terrible ending for him. This guy who didn't do anything wrong. And it, when you think about, and I did as I was watching it, what was happening to him, it's a terrifying idea. And the film is really good too. Uh, Considering the budget and the time when they made it and everything, it's a good story, well told. So the Wolfman, um, and I, and you know, and the worst part of it for this poor guy, he couldn't even die because it's a Universal movie. So every movie, it doesn't matter if he's beaten by a silver cane or shot by a silver bullet, or it doesn't matter what happens to him. The next full moon, he's back up there causing trouble. So, you know, even silver doesn't really kill him, you know, because the needs of the studio made him immortal. So, yeah, the Wolfman. Uh, that's an excellent, excellent story. So that brings me to number 6, a non-horror story that you consider horror. I'm not the only one that considers this a horror story, but in the popular imagination at least, I don't think this is regarded as a horror story. And that would be Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which is disturbing and scary in all kinds of ways. Wuthering Heights. One of the most passionately written stories ever. It could or it might or might not have a supernatural element in it. It's kind of, you know, is it, you know, are these characters coming, or is this character that could be a ghost really a ghost? Is the supernatural really manifesting in this story? Of course I say yes, because in fiction, unlike in real life, I always opt for the supernatural as an explanation. But also, there are no pleasant characters in this novel. It's full of abuse and unkindness and suffering and angry, bitter characters and selfishness. And it's just, I wasn't expecting that when I read it. It's hardcore, man, this story. And it kind of, it shows how a victim of abuse could grow up so bitter and angry that this victim will continue the cycle of abuse and just be terrible. Heathcliff is a monster. I wasn't expecting that when I first read this story. I thought this was going to be like this historical romance, because that's how it's kind of billed, right? Wuthering Heights, this historical romance on the moors. It's not that at all. I mean, there is an element of romance, of course, but also possessiveness, and it's just all kinds of dark stuff in this book. And Heathcliff is a terrible, terrible person. Partially because he was abused and treated terribly as a young person. And you're also given the sense that he might be something more than just human. You know, it's interesting. And there are a lot of ways you could read this story. In every way, it ends up being a horror story, in my opinion. Wuthering Heights. Yeah, it should be considered, I think, a straight-up horror novel. But that's my opinion. So anyway, 18 minutes. See, this is what I'm saying. The sun! The sun! So, yeah, I'm done talking now. Hopefully I'll be able to get this out today. If not, I'll get it out at some point. Yeah. Okay, guys. That's all I have to say about this tag. I'll catch you next time. Okay, I'm just kidding. I forgot to tag people. I should probably tag people for this tag. So I'm going to tag 4 people. And none of these people are horror tubers or people that focus on horror. So I thought, you know, I thought I would do that just to see what their answers or opinions might be. The first person I'm going to tag is A.J. Dunn from A.J. Dunn Reads and Writes. A.J. does not read horror, but they do read some things that seem sad and disturbing and could border on horror. And so I was wondering what their opinion on these, you know, on these questions would be. So I'm going to tag A.J. Dunn. Don't have to do it, A.J., but if you want to, I would be interested to see some of those answers. Also, I'm going to tag Kevvie from CS Kevvie. Great channel. I'll link it down below. All these people I'll link down below. But Kevvie, again, does a lot of mystery and things like that. So that would be interesting. Don't feel pressured, but Kevvie, if you want to do it, I tag you. I'm also going to tag DS from who that's a philosophy channel, but he does a lot of book related stuff, and has mentioned science fiction and horror many times, and I think could knock this tag out of the park. So I'm gonna don't feel like you have to do it if you're even watching it, but DS, I tag that channel, and Steve Donoghue, who doesn't read horror but has read it much. Steve Donoghue's read horror, but horror isn't really Steve's thing. But Steve's read everything in the world, and so I'm going to tag Steve, even though it might seem like an unusual tag for Steve to do. I don't know if Steve Donoghue will do it or is watching this, but why not? I'll tag Steve. Okay, now I'm done. I'll shut up now. Thanks, guys.